The Yik-Yak Mine by Grant Crowther. From the book Rula's Not Stupid Anymore and Other Short Horror Stories. Illustrated by Andrei Donkovich. Read by John Kosterez.
The Yik-Yak Mine. The mid-morning sun cast an ethereal glow over the jagged peaks of the western mountains. The air was thin but crisp and ringing with the strange songs of the mountain birds. Forests dense with towering pines stood like ghostly sentinels, their shadows stretching out and dancing in the wind. It was a world that was as eerie as it was beautiful. 3 men, each burdened not just by their heavy backpacks, but by the weight of golden aspirations, meandered the serpentine path that promised to lead them to fortunes untold. From the smog-choked cities of the East Coast, where industry roared and dreams often withered, they had ventured forth, riding the iron beast of a train to the vast, untamed expanse of the western mountains. Their journey the day before had brought them to a sparse, almost ghostly town, where the train tracks ended and stood in defiance of the wilderness around it. The price of a night's stay had been exorbitant, a clear exploitation of their unfamiliarity with this frontier. The locals, with eyes like vultures, had sized them up quickly, identifying them as out-of-place seekers of wealth. Come dawn, under a sky that had been painted with the hues of early morning, they had negotiated a ride up the mountain. The wagoner, a man whose wrinkles had told tales of sun and wind, had demanded a fee that was nothing short of daylight robbery. The trio, resilient and determined, had chosen to have him take them only halfway, confident in their resolve to trek the rest of the way on foot. Their absence of mining equipment would, after all, make their ascent less cumbersome. When the men had shared their plans to procure their mining gear from the town nestled high in the mountain's embrace, the wagoner's laughter had held no warmth. With a sardonic smile, he had offered a wish of luck, the undertones of which had spoken of challenges and mysteries yet to come. Now they pressed forward, Mitch at the forefront, embodying the essence of their determination. His lean physique, sculptured by years of grueling labor, paired with a penetrating gaze, lent him an air of intensity that was almost predatory. Yet this fierce demeanor was skillfully balanced by a magnetic charisma, one that captivated those around him, compelling them to embrace the realm of the impossible. Then there was Jack, their most experienced member, a sturdy, barrel-chested man. Time had claimed the hair atop his head, leaving a frame of silver around his bare crown. His ruddy nose and round belly, indicative of countless hearty meals, bore witness to his long-standing duel, not only with the passage of time, but also with the seductive allure of whiskey. Last but not least was Jacob, barely out of his youth. His wide-eyed optimism and innocent enthusiasm made him the dreamer of the group. It had been Mitch's persuasive charm that had lured this young man into the gold rush adventure, pulling him away from the comforting embrace of his sweetheart back in the city they'd left behind. Amidst the rustling of leaves and the distant cries of unknown creatures, Mitch paused. The soft glow of his cigarette flared brightly as he inhaled, casting an orange glow on his face, revealing a meditative look. He held the smoky air in his lungs for a second before exhaling a large plume of smoke, letting it mingle with the crisp, cool air of the mountains. "Look around, fellas," Mitch said in a tone filled with reverence, as he gestured to the sprawling landscape. "This isn't just nature. This is our salvation, our freedom. These wild, untouched lands are our ticket out of that wretched life back at the wheel factory." Jack, panting from exertion, beads of sweat forming on his brow, replied with a smirk, "You see freedom, I see fortune. Don't get me wrong, Mitch. This view, worth every step. But it's the glint of gold that brought me here. Mitch turned to Jack, eyes glinting with mischief. Always about the tangible with you, huh, Jack? Then, looking to their younger counterpart, he asked, "And what of you, Jacob? Any regrets about embarking on this madness with us old-timers?" Jacob's eyes, alight with dreams yet to be realized, sparkled with conviction. "Not one, Mitch. I swear, it's like I can sense the gold beckoning me. Picture it, in a year from now, owning a swath of land somewhere in the plains, where the earth blesses you with its own kind of gold. Susie and I, married and starting a family. That's the dream." Mitch's smirk widened into a genuine smile, his hand landing heavily but affectionately on Jacob's back. "That's what I wanted to hear. Onward, then, to glory and untold treasures." Their conversation ebbed as they continued their arduous climb, the mountains whispering old secrets in their ears. The towering pines seemed to sway with an ancient rhythm, rustling eerily in the wind. Every now and then, the mournful hoot of an owl or scurrying of unseen creatures would punctuate the silence, lending an aura of mystery to their journey. As the gold rush town emerged over the horizon, a wave of anticipation washed over them. The treacherous path, the eerie forest, and the exhausting journey all seemed to fade into the background. Their dreams were within reach now, and the real adventure was just about to begin. The sight of the town almost seemed like a mirage against the sprawling wilderness. Any settlement this far up in the mountains seemed surreal to the three men who hailed from a huge coastal city. A single, dusty road ran through the heart of it, undulating with the contours of the land. It was flanked on both sides by a collection of makeshift buildings, each one standing as a monument to the entrepreneurial spirit that the booming gold rush had sparked. Every structure appeared hastily constructed from rough-hewn timber, yet there was an undeniable charm to the elaborate facades facing the street. The builders, savvy in the art of marketing, had adorned their door and window frames with intricately patterned trims. Colorful awnings and luxurious drapery hung from exteriors, their garish hues striking a brilliant contrast with the earthy tones of the dirt road and the plain wooden frames of the buildings. Bold lettering and illustrations adorned the facades, ensuring their wearers were clearly visible to the scores of prospectors, many of whom were illiterate. The barber shop, its pole spinning in red and white, beckoned the unkempt prospectors for a trim and a shave. Beside it, the bank stood solemn and resolute, its door a gateway to the dreams and riches that men hope to extract from the unforgiving earth. The post office, humming with activity, was a lifeline for the many men who left everything behind. Its presence served as a poignant reminder of the world they had left, promising news from home and civilization. A few steps away, the hotel, with its slightly more polished facade, promised warmth and rest for weary bodies. The glow from its windows spoke of the luxuries of a soft bed and a hot meal, rarities after the hard journey. But perhaps the most strategic establishment was the hardware store, its shelves laden with shovels, pickaxes, and pans, the tools of the prospector's trade. As the old adage went, why dig for gold when you could get rich selling the shovels? The store stood as a testament to this wisdom, thriving on the hopes and dreams of those who came seeking their fortune. And finally, there was the saloon, the undeniable pulse of the town. Even from a distance, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the discordant notes from an old piano filled the air, promising camaraderie and respite from the restless pursuit of gold. The town teemed with a heavy mix of hope, tension, and anticipation. Each man eyed the other with a weariness born from the shared dream of striking gold. Amidst this riotous color and noise, this town represented the heartbeat of the gold rush, a place where dreams were bought and sold, and fortunes were made or lost with the swing of a pickaxe. When the men finally reached the town, the sun was beginning to dip between the serrated peaks of the mountain range. The gold-flecked rays cast long shadows on the bustling street, stretching out the hubbub of the day into twilight. To their disappointment, the bank had already shuttered its doors for the day. It was the bank they needed. The hunt for gold wasn't as simple as picking up a shovel and digging. The stories of brutal confrontations over lucrative patches of land were all too common, whispered around the campfires and echoed in the dank corners of watering holes. Greed had a way of twisting men's minds, and the promise of gold was the most potent elixir of all. To prevent such deadly disputes, land leases were implemented. A prospector had to secure a plot of land from the bank, designating a specific territory where they had the exclusive right to dig. It was a system as vital as the veins of gold they sought. Choosing the right plot was as critical as choosing the right tools for the job. A wrong decision could spell the difference between striking it rich or returning home empty-handed. But with the bank closed until morning, the men were left with little to do but find a place to rest. They rented a room at the hotel, a welcome luxury after the grueling journey. But only after a few minutes' rest in the room, the lively notes wafting from the saloon lured the men, who had all too often enjoyed a good brew. The promise of a stiff drink and a respite from their impending work was a siren's call they couldn't resist. Mitch, always the most level-headed of the three, cautioned his friends. "Not too much, boys," he advised, eyes twinkling under the dim light of the saloon. "We've got a long road ahead of us, and every cent counts." So they settled into their seats, the warmth of the saloon and the camaraderie of their shared adventure wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. Their journey was just beginning, and the coming morning held the promise of gold. The saloon was a hive of activity, filled with hardened prospectors whose eyes had seen fortune rise and fall in the blink of an eye. The locals, cunning and hardened by their pursuits, were a stark contrast to the trio, who wore their inexperience like a badge, standing out among the crowd of seasoned miners. As Mitch, Jack, and Jacob scanned the bustling establishment, they drew more than a few curious glances. The city slickers had stood out like sore thumbs amidst the throng of grizzled men whose faces told stories of laborious days and lonely nights. These men, weathered and seasoned by the unforgiving elements, eyed the trio with a particular blend of amusement and predatory interest. The evening began innocently enough. Laughter flowed as freely as the alcohol, and the other patrons welcomed the newcomers, listening intently as the trio boasted about their determination and future exploits. Encouraging words and tales of legendary hauls were exchanged, painting vivid images of instant riches and dreams within arm's reach. However, as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The men of the town, sly as foxes, began to show their true colors. A few strategically convinced Mitch to join a game of poker, baiting him with the promise of an easy win. Jack found himself ensnared in a drinking game that quickly turned costly, where each loss translated into a round of drinks. And Jacob, the youngest and most naive, found himself under the spell of a seasoned harlot, lured away from the revelry under the guise of a romantic encounter. Morning found the three men nursing splitting headaches, their pockets nearly empty and their spirits heavily dampened. They had gambled away a significant portion of their savings, seduced by the heady promise of easy wealth and the deceptive camaraderie of the saloon. The harsh morning light brought with it a bitter realization. The road to gold was fraught with more dangers than they had initially thought, and some of these perils were not buried within the earth, but walked on two legs, hiding in plain sight. The morning air was crisp and biting as the three men met on the town's main street, the somber expressions on their faces a stark contrast to the joviality of the previous night. All around them, the town was waking up. Dust swirled around their feet as they converged, their heads throbbing, spirits dampened, and pockets much lighter. "What the hell happened last night?" Jack groaned, rubbing his temples to alleviate the pounding in his head. Mitch grimaced, admitting with a sigh, "We were fools. Got taken in by the charm of the place and let our guards down." We were swindled out of our savings." Jacob, still trying to shake off the effects of the alcohol, remained silent, letting the older men argue. "How much do we have left?" Jack inquired, his brow furrowing with concern. Mitch reluctantly dug into his pocket and pulled out a small bag of coins. "Not much. Barely enough to buy the tools we need, let alone secure the land lease." A disagreement began to brew. Jack, believing in the importance of securing their plot, argued, "We need to lease the land first, Mitch. There's no point in having tools if we've got no place to dig." Mitch, however, had a different view. "No, we need to get the tools first. What good is a plot of land if we don't have the means to mine it?" As the two older men continued to argue, Jacob watched them, his mind a whirl of regret and uncertainty. But he chose to remain neutral, allowing Mitch's assertiveness to eventually overshadow Jack's argument. Resigned, the trio trudged toward the hardware store, their hope now hanging on the promise of gleaming shovels and sturdy pickaxes. As the men entered, a cold shiver passed down Mitch's spine. He saw the rows of tools, all tagged with exorbitant prices, and his heart sank. The dimly lit room smelled of earth, metal, and the undeniable scent of greed. The establishment was monopolistic, the only one of its kind for miles around. Their wallets didn't stand a chance. The store clerk, a wiry man with a crooked smile and sly eyes, approached the trio. "Gentlemen," he inquired, "looking for something specific?" "We need digging equipment," Mitch said, his voice steady despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. With a glint in his eyes, the store clerk guided them through the store. "You need a sturdy shovel, a lantern for those dark mines, and a good old pickaxe, of course," he enumerated, pointing to each item in turn. Mitch frowned at the outrageous prices. 5 coins for a shovel, 2 for a lantern, and 4 for a pickaxe? That's highway robbery. The store clerk only shrugged, his smile never faltering. "Supply and demand, sir. The tools are here. The gold is out there. It's your choice." The 3 men exchanged worried glances. Their options were limited. Reluctantly, they dug into their pockets, their faces hard as they forked over the precious coins. As they left the store, each clutching their newly acquired tools, the hardware store clerk leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Ah, the price of dreams," he chuckled to himself as he counted the coins. The day was off to a good start. The morning sun shone brightly down the single street of the gold rush town, casting a warm golden hue over the colorful buildings lining its path. While each structure had its own distinct charm and craftsmanship, the bank stood out, a tad more majestic, a hint more regal, as if it wore an invisible crown. As they approached, its grand facade seemed to beckon them, showcasing an extra touch of elegance and polish that set it apart. Pushing open the heavy oak doors, they were greeted by an interior that seemed out of place in such a remote land. Gleaming mahogany desks sat under the sunlit glow from tall, arched windows, while the gold accents on the walls and fixtures shimmered subtly. The plush red carpet, softer underfoot than any they had trodden upon, was a nod to the prosperity this gold boom had ushered in. From a dim corner of the lavish chamber, a rich laughter rippled, drawing their gaze. The figure that emerged was the bank manager. Short and stout, his very presence seemed to consume more space than his stature suggested. His mustache, enormous and meticulously groomed, held an air of mischief, while his eyes, warm on the surface, concealed a calculating glint. "Gentlemen," the manager spoke in the velvety tone of a seasoned salesman, "you've entered the very lifeblood of our burgeoning enclave. Most newcomers inevitably find themselves here. Thus, I wear the dual hats of greeter and gatekeeper. With a grace that belied his rotund figure, he motioned them into his inner chamber. While this room echoed the bank's opulence, it gave off a palpable sense of privacy and secrecy. Mitch nodded in appreciation. This room would have hosted every gold prospector who had come before them. As they settled into the inviting chairs, a mix of comfort and subtle tension hung in the air. The manager leaned in and inquired, "How might I be of service today?" Mitch took a deep breath and said, "We're looking to lease some land for prospecting." The manager's eyes twinkled. "Ah, prospectors. Always excited to help new gold miners find their fortune." He gestured grandly for the men to come forward. "Leave your tools by the door. Don't worry, your things are safe in here." His jovial demeanor turned solemn when asking the next question. "So what is your budget?" Mitch, always the diplomat, chimed in first. "Well, let's see. What do you have?" The manager opened a drawer and pulled out a large surveyor's map and spread it on the desk. "Blue dots represent currently leased lands. Green dots are available," he explained, his finger tracing over the map. "Each available land is noted with a price tag per month, depending on the location and potential yield." Huddled closely around the vast map spread out before them, the trio meticulously studied each section under the warm golden light of the ornate chandelier hanging above. Its luminescence deepened the furrows of worry that etched the faces of the three spirited adventurers. Every parcel of land, boldly marked with its daunting price tag, felt agonizingly out of reach given their rapidly depleting funds. The manager, bearing the tired eyes of someone who had watched countless dreams crumble in the face of stark reality, was clearly inching towards impatience. Then Mitch's gaze narrowed onto an anomaly, a corner patch seemingly marred by time or neglect. A faint impression suggested a blue or green emblem might once have graced it, but now hastily scribbled were the words, "Yik-Yak Mine," with a price that seemed absurdly humble, just 10 coins per month. His finger landing squarely on the anomaly, Mitch looked up, questioning, "What's the story behind this one?" For a moment, the bank manager's mask of affable authority wavered, replaced by genuine unease. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself against an old, chilling wind. "Ah, the Yik-Yak Mine," he began, reluctance evident in every word. "That particular claim, gentlemen, is not up for lease." He stated, his tone final, shutting down any inkling of negotiation. "Why not for lease?" "It's displayed clear as day on this map," Mitch asserted, a challenging glint in his eyes. Beside him, Jack added, "If it's on the map, it's fair game," while Jacob, though less confrontational, nodded in agreement, his eyes showing a hint of desperation. The bank manager leaned back, intertwining his fingers and taking a moment to collect his thoughts before responding. "Gentlemen," he began cautiously, "there are places on this earth that hold stories that are better left behind. And the Yik-Yak Mine is one of those." Mitch raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident. "Stories? Is that all? We're not paying for tales. We're paying for land." The manager's voice lowered, a sense of gravity settling in. "You misunderstood. These aren't just stories. Horrible events have happened up there." Jack, ever the realist, cut in. "Sounds to me like a ruse to keep the best plots for the town's elites. We aren't greenhorns, sir. We've heard enough tall tales to last a lifetime." Jacob, chiming in for the first time, added, "Look, all we want is a chance. A piece of land to call our own, and to deliver on our promises to our loved ones back home." The bank manager seemed to waver, caught between a genuine concern and the determination of the three men. Then, with a heavy sigh, his resistance crumbled. All right, but on your heads be it. Know that it's haunted, cursed with demons of unknown origin." Mitch, unable to resist the urge to be brash, laughed outright, dismissing the bank manager's warning with audacity that only further aggravated him. Visibly agitated, the manager continued tersely, "The lease spans a compulsory 3 months. That's 30 coins, plus an additional 10 coins for insurance and surcharge. So, you owe 40 coins in total." Pooling their resources, the trio scraped together the required 40 coins, leaving a meager 7 coins remaining. They finalized the agreement with each man's signature, though Jacob struggled to pen his own name, and in return received the lease agreement and a detailed map leading to their new territory. Rising from their seats, they exited the room with a mix of jubilation and defiance. As they left, Mitch couldn't resist one last derisive snort, dismissing the bank manager's foreboding story. The stout mustached man watched them depart, a knot of regret forming in his stomach. His momentary lapse in judgment had potentially doomed the men to a fate he dared not utter aloud. He trotted behind them into the bank's main room and yelled out one more offer. "You can still take the money back. You really shouldn't go." But the men were deaf to his plea and did not respond to his words. Instead, they headed out onto the street. After pooling their money, the trio meticulously allotted their funds for provisions. They secured large burlap sacks of coffee beans, flour, and sugar, a few pounds of lard, a basket brimming with eggs, several lofty cans of beans, and a bottle of syrup. For the cold, lonely nights, 3 large bottles of whiskey were deemed essential. A stroke of fortune allowed them to strike a deal with an old-timer, acquiring a sturdy wagon to haul their supplies for the meager price of one of their whiskey bottles. With deeply etched lines marking years of hard living, the grizzled man claimed he had no further use for it. This transaction felt like a triumph to Mitch, Jacob, and Jack, not only facilitating their immediate needs, but bolstering their morale for the journey ahead. As they trekked away, the elderly man's voice trailed after them, his words tinged with foreboding. "Watch out for the ghost up there," he cackled with a disturbing glee. Dismissing it as the ramblings of a decaying mind, the men continued on, albeit with a slight unease. Their lease agreement, now their most treasured possession, was accompanied by a detailed map. This map, rich with topographical markings, showed footprints and the hand-drawn silhouette of a cabin. Such a luxury was more than they had dared to hope for. No longer would they need to endure nights on the uneven forest floor, shielded only by their threadbare tents. Now, they'd have a sturdy roof overhead and solid wooden walls to shield them from the cold nights ahead. Their journey was beginning to seem less a gamble and more a well-thought-out adventure. As the afternoon sun cast shimmering reflections off the map, they plotted their course to the Yik-Yak Mine. Dismissing the haunting echoes of the wilderness, the men's journey was filled with laughter and banter. They took turns pulling the wagon, spirits high and full of anticipation. The forest was a dense tapestry of towering conifers, swaying bushes, and babbling brooks. The air was alive with a chorus of birds, their melodies weaving seamlessly with the rustling of leaves, a true symphony of nature. But had they listened more intently, they might have detected the odd cadence in the birds' calls and the faint whispers beneath the rustling leaves. It was as though the forest, disturbed by their intrusion, watched with a malevolent gaze as the miners delved deeper into its heart. As they navigated through the dense woods, Mitch's voice echoed with an almost manic glee. "The greatest men in history are those who dared, those who took the road less traveled," he proclaimed, slashing a branch out of its path with a makeshift machete. "Who are these country rubes to believe in ghosts and devils? Such primitive superstitions will be our winning hand. Just imagine the gold left untouched because of these ludicrous fears." He paused to look back at Jack and Jacob, a wide grin stretching across his face. "They'll sing songs about us, boys. The 3 brave souls who saw past the ignorance and superstition, who dared to venture in the accursed Yik-Yak Mine and came out millionaires." Jack chuckled, his eyes dancing with dreams of wealth and success. "Once we strike gold, I'm buying a saloon of my own, but not anywhere near this desolate place. Nah, I'm heading back to the coast. I'll buy the old Duck and Barrel. The finest whiskey will flow freely, and the patrons will raise their glasses to our names." Jacob's expression turned wistful as he imagined a life beyond the grueling labor and squalor they were used to. "And I'll finally marry Susie. I'll buy a grand ranch for us, with green pastures as far as the eye can see, with hired farmhands so she never has to lift a finger, and we can enjoy the rest of our days in leisure." Mitch seemed to mull over their dreams and then shared his own grand plan. "When we're done here, I'll buy a grand ship and sail the 7 seas. I'll dine with the elites in all the world's best restaurants. Oh, the tales I'll tell them of 3 brave men who dared to confront the unknown and emerge victorious." "And the best whores," Jack chided with a sideways grin, and the other men laughed. As dusk settled, the once vibrant hues of the forest shifted to darker, more haunting shades. The inky shadows that danced between the trees grew increasingly foreboding. Noises once dismissed grew louder and more ominous, making Jacob flinch with every eerie echo. Even the familiar hoots of distant owls or the sound of twigs snapping beneath their feet took on an unsettling quality. A tangible, chilling aura was arising in the shadows around them. "What's that?" Jacob yelled suddenly, with a jarring pitch that made the other 2 men jump. "What are you talking about?" Mitch asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. "There," Jacob said, pointing to the spot beneath the path. In the waning light, a stark white shape was unmistakably affixed to a tree trunk, the eerie vestige of a human skull. As the others looked, they saw not just a skull, but also arm and leg bones arranged in a macabre design, fastened securely to the tree, whether by nails or some other adhesive. "Just one of the former tenant's ideas of a sick joke," Mitch grumbled, resolutely pulling the wagon forward, his intent clear, to move away from the morbid sight as quickly as possible. Jack nodded, pausing just a moment longer before stating, "Mitch is right. This is just someone's twisted sense of humor." He quickly rejoined Mitch, continuing down the path, while Jacob lingered, his gaze fixed on the unmistakably human skull. "You guys aren't worried?" Jacob's voice quivered slightly. "It's sick," Mitch called back, his voice tense. "But remember, the banker warned us about the legends surrounding this place. People have died up here. I never denied that. And that display could have been crafted from one such unfortunate soul." "But how did he die?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling just a tad. "Miners die," Jack said matter-of-factly. "These old mines aren't safe, and accidents happen. We knew this when we signed up for it," Jack reasoned. Jacob nodded, taking a moment before catching up with the others. Their earlier lightheartedness had evaporated, replaced by a sober intensity. Mitch, bearing the brunt of their load, steadfastly pulled the wagon ahead. As hours dragged on and their path inclined, the weight of fatigue bore down on them. Yet, in a way, their weariness dulled the edge of the forest-growing eeriness. As the last light of the day began to wane, shadows danced and expanded around them. "Is that it?" Jacob's voice pierced the stillness, tinged with hope. He gestured toward a silhouette breaking the tree line. Peering ahead, Mitch nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "It is." The dark outline gradually sharpened, revealing a solid cabin framed by towering trees. The small details, the porch, a window, the moss-covered shingles, and a sturdy chimney, all signaled that a decently constructed little domicile did indeed await them. This haven amidst the ominous woods brought palpable relief. Even Mitch, usually so stoic, looked visibly heartened. "We made it, boys." But the forest's malevolent grip wasn't going to release them just yet. Nearby, a disquieting rustling came from the bushes, punctured by the stark crack of a sizable branch just off to the side of their path. A chilling, guttural growl swiftly followed. And this time, it wasn't just Jacob who jumped. An unmistakable wave of fear washed over them all. "Run!" Jack's urgent cry sliced through the mounting fear. Darting a quick glance behind, he was certain he saw the hulking silhouette of a massive bear barreling down on them. The pounding cadence of its approach sent shivers of panic through each man, propelling them into a frantic spirit toward the cabin, their gear jostling violently with every step. Mitch, ever determined, clung to the wagon, dragging it despite its jostling contents. A few eggs tumbled out, smearing the path behind them. As the cabin's entrance neared, he finally released the wagon, which careened to the side, and joined the desperate race to the door. Reaching the refuge, Jack's trembling hands struggled with the doorknob, precious seconds passing before they stumbled inside. Slamming the door shut, they secured it, their rapid breaths the only sound. The bear's menacing growl eventually retreated, but its haunting echo lingered in their ears. "Where are our supplies?" Jack's voice bordered on panic as he rushed to the cabin's little front window. He half expected to witness the bear ravaging their provisions, but to his astonishment, nothing was there. Mitch joined him, taking a closer look. Their wagon lay toppled just short of the porch, its contents scattered. While some tools and food sacks lay strewn about, the wagon was largely undisturbed, and more importantly, no bear in sight. After a few tense moments of vigilant scanning, relief replaced their alarm. Convinced of the beast's absence, they ventured out to retrieve their belongings and secured them inside the cabin. The cabin itself was a bastion against the looming wilderness outside. Its sturdy walls seemed to shield them from the forest's oppressive mood. Stepping inside felt like entering another world. To their delight, a spacious living area awaited them, with a grand stone fireplace taking center stage. Its dormant hearth hinted at countless cozy evenings spent by its flames. While the furniture bore the weight of years, its charm was undeniable. 4 sturdy little armchairs, a sofa with worn-out plaid fabric, a robust table, and a quaint rug underfoot transformed the space into a homey retreat. For a moment, the forest malevolence faded, replaced by the comforting embrace of their newfound haven. Beyond the living area, they discovered a compact kitchen, surprisingly well equipped with pots, pans, utensils, and even a sink. Outside, a water pump and an outhouse stood at a convenient distance. At the back of the cabin were the sleeping quarters. 3 sets of bunk beds, each with its own worn yet clean set of sheets, were lined up against the walls. Each could have comfortably accommodated 2 miners, speaking to the cabin's past life. The men's spirits lifted further as they took in their surroundings. This was more than just a shelter. It was a base, a home they could return to after their arduous mining efforts. It was the beginning of their golden dream. Mitch lit a fire in the fireplace, its warm glow reflecting in the men's faces as they settled into their new abode. While the forest still whispered its creepy tales outside their door, inside the cabin, the men enjoyed a few glasses of whiskey and indulged in cheerful banter. The chilling episode in the forest was slowly forgotten, replaced by the excitement of their gold-seeking dreams and the comforting familiarity of their new dwelling. Despite the dust and cobwebs, which were quickly dealt with, the cabin offered more comfort than they had hoped for. "We really hit the jackpot with this place, didn't we?" Jack remarked, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "Makes you wonder why no one claimed it before us, doesn't it?" Mitch replied, a half-smile playing on his lips. The men enjoyed a few more rounds of chatter and calming whiskey before they began the pre-bedtime chores of shaking off bed sheets, brushing teeth, and peeing off the deck. The men might have calmed down from earlier, but they were all still a little too weary to venture to that outhouse in the dark. Outside, the forest remained daunting, filled with animal sounds, undeniable noises occurring sporadically, which the men tried their best to ignore. Jack ventured to a previously unexplored corner of the cabin. Hidden in the shadow, a weathered desk sat, cloaked in layers of dust and cobwebs. As he carelessly brushed his teeth, Jack's curiosity got the better of him. He began to sift through the desk's contents. His fingers stumbled upon a brittle piece of paper, yellowed and curled with age. Cautiously, he unfurled it, revealing a poem penned in a fading, hurried script. The weight of the words pulled the others closer as Jack began to recite with a mouthful of toothpaste. Where shadows of the past reside, in cabin's heart, they chose to hide. Spectral whispers do confide of gold's curse and deadly pride. "What are you saying?" Jacob asked nervously, not liking the sound of the words. "Just a weird poem. I found it in the desk," Jack replied warily. He returned to the kitchen, swished out his mouth with water, and put down his toothbrush. Then he went back to the little desk for further inspection. Beneath the paper, a worn, leather-bound journal sat. As Jack picked it up and flipped through its yellowed pages, skimming the entries, he surmised it was a logbook from past miners. "There are numerous dates and names here," Jack mentioned, continuing his scan of the journal. "Oh, come on," Mitch chimed in swiftly, attempting to dispel the unease. "A journal from past miners? They probably filled it with horror tales just to scare us. That's probably where all the hogwash about this place comes from. A ruse to keep people away from the good finds they discovered here." Mitch seemed thoroughly convinced by his own words, but Jack and Jacob looked skeptical. Jack took the journal, sat in front of the fire, and became engrossed in its pages, while the other two men awaited his review with anticipation. Jack began cautiously. "You guys, this stuff ain't good." Jacob, now entirely unsettled, leapt onto the couch next to Jack and tried to read over his shoulder, but it was futile. Jacob was illiterate. "What's it saying?" Jacob inquired, his voice betraying his fear. Clearing his throat, Jack began to recite a passage. "Today we settled into the cabin. This place seems great. We've all eaten and we will get a good rest. Tomorrow we will head down the shaft and start working. I'd be more excited about everything if things didn't feel so strange. I swear I keep hearing whispers, and it feels like there's someone else here with us. Even then, Chuck said someone kicked him. He raged at us, demanding to know who did it, but he was in the kitchen when it happened, and we all were seated. This place might be haunted." Jack paused, exchanging a concerned glance with Jacob. "Oh, please," Mitch interjected, feigning nonchalance. "This is obviously a joke." "How do you know?" Jacob retorted angrily. "Keep reading, Jack. What happens next?" Jack continued, turning to a subsequent entry. "Today we ventured into the mines. The mountain is indeed rich in gold. We barely began our work when Chuck, unnerved by something, swung his pickaxe haphazardly. Before we knew it, Donnie was injured. We restrained Chuck and hurriedly brought Donnie out. Now we're back in the cabin. Night approaches, so our return to the mine must wait. Chuck seemed in denial, and Donnie's in bad shape. He's unconscious and losing blood." "Oh my God!" Jacob exclaimed, horrified. "What's next?" Jack leafed through the journal and paused. "What is it?" Jacob pressed. "Nothing," Jack answered. "The next entry is from a different group, many months later." Seizing the opportunity, Mitch grabbed the journal. "Boys," he cried jubilantly, "you overlooked the vital part. The mountain is rich in gold." He returned the book to the desk. They must have left with their fortunes, he speculated, excitement evident. Yet the other men remained doubtful. No more ghost stories tonight, Mitch declared. After some reflection, Jack seemed to concur. Nodding to Jacob, who often sought guidance from the more experienced Jack, they all decided to retire. They were excited yet apprehensive about the following day's excavation. Despite the foreboding feeling, they clung to their dreams, the glint of gold, the promise of a brighter future and a better life. The fear of failure was even more terrifying than the ghostly voices carried on the wind. With these thoughts swirling in their minds, one by one, the men succumbed to a restless sleep. A new day dawned, the harsh light of morning piercing through the grime-encrusted windows of the cabin. The men groggily prepared their morning sustenance, the air laden with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and frying pancakes. Their tools, newly purchased from the crafty hardware store clerk, lay scattered around them, a symbol of the back-breaking labor that awaited. They didn't talk much, their joviality from the previous night replaced by a silent determination. They understood that this was it. They had ventured this far for this very moment. Gathering their tools, they ventured out, lanterns swinging from their hands, casting long dancing shadows onto the dense undergrowth. Their map guided them to the remnants of a pathway. Despite its decay, the path's direction was clear, leading them directly towards the looming rocky mountainside. The twisted pathway gave way to a clearing where the mountain's raw, exposed rock stood tall. In its core was a gaping entrance to a mine shaft, shrouded in darkness. Above it, a weather-worn wooden sign hung precariously, its letters faded, yet still decipherable. They read the words aloud as a group, their voices echoing in the cold morning air. Yik-Yak Mine. Suddenly, the wind picked up, slicing through the quiet like a knife. A howl emerged from the depths of the tunnel, echoing outwards, chilling their spines and causing the hairs at the back of their necks to stand on end. Jacob jumped, a sharp yell escaping his lips. His eyes widened with fear as he turned to his companions. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It sounded like a laugh." Mitch sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Don't tell me you're scared, Jacob," he mocked. His voice was strong, commanding, a stark contrast to Jacob's frightened whisper. "We came here for gold, not to run away at the first sign of danger." "But Mitch, that wasn't normal. It sounded like—" Jacob's voice trailed off as he struggled to find the words to describe what he heard. Mitch cut him off. "Like what, Jacob? A ghost?" He let out a derisive laugh. "This is a mine, not a haunted house. We all just read the sign out loud. That was just an echo of our own voices. Now, unless you want to go back to living off your girlfriend's money, I suggest we carry on." Their argument echoed off the rocky mountainside and was swallowed by the gaping entrance to the Yik-Yak Mine. Mitch's stern words and relentless pressure overcame their resistance. Mitch pointed out 2 large mining carts discarded near the entranceway. "These could come in handy, but let's check things out first." And with lingering trepidation, they finally agreed to venture into the mine. As the men ignited their lanterns, the yellow glow barely penetrated the deep obsidian of the mine. The shaft was just over 6 feet tall, barely tall enough to accommodate the tallest of the men. With a width no greater than 5 feet, the mine felt claustrophobically tight, yet also alarmingly deep. What struck the men as they delved deeper into the Yik-Yak Mine was its seemingly unnatural straightness. It was almost as if it was bored straight into the mountain, rather than having been dug out following a vein of gold. Its linear layout was far removed from the more traditional, branching structure of most mines they've heard of. Usually, miners would follow a vein of gold, deep into the earth, carving a network of tunnels and shafts. Indeed, the linear nature of the Yik-Yak Mine tunnel felt strangely out of place. Anyone with a basic knowledge of geology would know that mineral deposits, especially gold veins, were seldom, if ever, found in such a consistent, straight line. A gold vein formed when hot, mineral-rich fluids flowed into the cracks in the Earth's crust. These veins could meander in any direction, left, right, up, down, following the path of least resistance. But not this one, apparently. The mine was supported by a series of wooden sets, each one made up of 2 posts in a horizontal beam or cap. This traditional method of timbering was widely used for its simplicity, though the sight of time-worn, weathered wood bearing such an eminent load was disconcerting. Each echoing footstep reminded them of the colossal weight of the rock above their heads. As they delved deeper into the mine's passage, a stifling atmosphere settled around them. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence seemed to mute even the minor echoes of their footsteps. Every instinct screamed at them that something wasn't right. Their gut feelings, their primal instincts that had long protected ancestors from unseen predators, clawed at their resolve, urging them to turn back. But greed, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of hubris drove them onward. Each miner could feel it, the tangible weight of unease pressing on their chests, growing heavier with every step. The spine-chilling tales from the journal were no longer just stories. They felt like prophetic warnings. Whispers of dread wormed their way into their ears, a constant chilling reminder of the ignored cautionary tales from the journal. Suddenly, the endless forward march was halted by a sheer wall of cold, gray stone. It was a jarring end to the relentless tunnel, and all 3 men momentarily lost their bearings. One would have expected the prior excavators to taper off their tunnels, their pathways becoming narrower as resources dwindled, or they gave up on the vein. But this was different. The termination was abrupt, with the rock face bearing the scars of hasty pickaxe blows. Illuminating the area with their lanterns, the dancing amber light revealed patterns that seemed strangely deliberate. Upon closer inspection, those random gashes began to form shapes, primitive symbols, some geometric, others more arcane, etched into the rock. The uncanny carving sent shivers down their spines. But as they neared the rock wall, scrutinizing it with an intense gaze born of desperation and hope, a glint caught Jacob's eye. He blinked, crouched down, and shone his lantern onto the seemingly innocuous patch of rock right at the center of that wall. It gleamed, the warm light bouncing off a yellow metal embedded in the stone. "Look at that!" Jacob exclaimed, disbelief lacing his words. The others turned, their curiosity piqued. "Is it real?" Jack asked, his voice hushed as he squinted at the golden streak that Jacob's lantern illuminated. Mitch, ever the cynic, leaned in skeptically, scrutinizing the gold vein with a hardened gaze. And then he saw it too, the undeniable glimmer of gold. His skepticism melted away, replaced by a greed-fueled excitement. The men erupted into shouts of joy, their previous apprehensions forgotten in the face of this golden promise. They eagerly brandished their picks, Mitch leading the charge. The ring of metal on rock filled the tunnel as they began chipping away at the stone, each strike a step closer to their dreams. The echo of their tools reverberated through the depths of the mine, the only sound breaking the otherwise eerie silence that enveloped them. The shard of rocks that fell away revealed more of the precious metal, fueling their enthusiasm further. Soon they had chipped out a chunk of the vein, its lustrous surface catching the lantern light and making their hearts leap with joy. Their initial disbelief morphed into giddy laughter and backslapping as they admired their find. "We've hit the mother lode," Mitch crowed, holding up a chunk of gold as big as a baseball. "We're going to be richer than a railroad tycoon," Jacob chimed in, a triumphant grin on his face. Jack, usually more reserved, couldn't hide his excitement either. "We've done it, boys," he cheered. It seemed as if their dreams of wealth and success were coming true. The hardships of their journey, their dwindling funds, the foreboding mine, all of it seemed worthwhile at the sight of the gleaming gold. They celebrated their victory, not noticing the echoing laughter that joined in their jubilant shouts. Amid the overwhelming rush of discovery and the magnetic pull of gold, the trio plunged into their toil with an intensity previously foreign to them. Every swing, every strike into the rock, was a symphony of burning muscles and taut sinew. With hands reddened and raw and backs drenched in sweat, they bore the brunt of their endeavor. And yet, every wince and hiss of pain was promptly forgotten with each glimpse of the treasure they were revealing. Veins of gold, some as robust as their own wrists, embedded within the rock, stood as luminous tokens of their unwavering dedication. As they toiled, the excavated chunks of rocks were neatly stacked into pyramidal piles, creating a gold-laced testament to their day's labor. Time seemed to warp and twist in the cavern's embrace. Hours melded into mere moments. Their sole measurement of its passage was the dwindling light from their lanterns, which began to waver and dim, projecting elongated, capering shadows against the rough cavern walls. Realizing the need to wrap things up before their fuel ran out, they made their way back towards the entrance of the mine to retrieve the ancient mining carts they had spotted there. As they returned to the outside world, an unsettling chill gripped Jacob. Amongst the play of the light and the dark from the flames, he spotted the eerie resemblance of elongated faces in those shadows. Emerging from the cave's maw, the men were momentarily blinded by the waning light of the setting sun. A blanket of shadows crept ominously across the landscape, threatening to obscure their path back to the cabin. Time was of the essence. With a combination of elbow grease and a liberal application of lubricant to the old rusty axles, the abandoned carts groaned, creaking back to life. Conversation was kept to a minimum, with a singular focus on each of the men's faces. Single-word instructions and answers were all that passed between the men as they hurried. The carts clattered and protested along the decrepit track. They were thankful for the tunnel's linear formation. When they finally arrived back to their haul of rocks, the men were hit with the realization that the volume of their find was staggering. A daunting task lay ahead, attempting to fit those mountainous piles into the limited confines of the rickety carts. Undeterred, they set to work, cramming in as much as the carts could bear. The men pressed forward, muscles tense as they pushed the heavy carts back along the path they had just traversed. Jacob, sweaty and tired, primarily supported Jack as they pushed the heavy carts together. Every so often, noting Mitch's fatigue, Jacob would switch over, trying to rebalance the workload. Their sheer determination was evident, driven by their overpowering greed and excitement. The cart's wheels shrieked loudly, echoing within the confines of the tunnel. As they emerged from the cave's darkness, the encroaching night greeted them, its dimness combined with the noises of nocturnal birds and creatures, giving the men an eerie welcome. When the day's work was finally done, the men howled and cheered in excitement and celebration. "Good work, boys," Mitch cried out in good cheer. Their joyous celebration had just only begun when it was brought to a sudden halt. Jack, who wanted a better look at some of those thick yellow veins of gold, sifted around in one of the carts, trying to find a good sample to examine. But as he pursed the rocks, his stomach dropped. The first chunk he held up had no gold in it at all. Holding it under the dim light of the moon, he squinted, trying to find some hint of metal, but failed. He dropped it to the ground and grabbed another. The result was the same. "What the hell?" Jack yelled. The other two men, who had been observing Jack's actions, quickly ran to the cart to do the same. Grabbing chunks of rock, one by one the men examined the cartload with hysterical excitement, along with cries of, "This is just rock, and it's all worthless!" They threw each chunk of rock to the ground as they inspected them. Not a single one had any gold to be found. The metallic treasure they'd worked so hard to chip from the mountain's core seemed to have vanished upon exiting the shaft. The previously brilliant veins that ran through the excavated rocks now appeared to be worthless gray stones in the dwindling twilight. "It's a trick. It must be the light," Mitch said, with a glimmer of hope returning to his voice. "Let's bring some back to the cabin," Jacob shouted. All three men were in agreement. No one could believe that there was actually no gold in these rocks. They had all seen it. They had touched it. So the men filled their pockets with as many chunks of rock as they could carry, and they headed back down the now almost invisible pathway back to the cabin. Full of enraged disbelief, they were all but sprinting their way home. More than a few times, the men tripped and fell, bruising their sides and scratching their arms and legs on branches. Once back in the cabin, Mitch ran around, lighting every possible lantern in its place, and Jacob set the fire ablaze. They wanted full illumination to make sure this wasn't just a trick from the shadows. Jack and Jacob threw their stone chunks onto the little table and took a seat. Once Mitch had lit every lantern he could, he joined them, slamming his own rocks down amongst the others. Sitting there together, the men were silent. The anticipation in the air was as thick as pea soup. Anxiously, each man grabbed a chunk and examined it. It was silent for a few moments. No one could believe this was happening. "It has to be some kind of hysteria," Jack said, his voice so hopeless it would have been humorous had the circumstances not been so grave. "You mean, like maybe there is gold, but we have convinced ourselves there isn't?" Jacob asked, the youthful optimism shining through his voice as he discarded the chunk he had been observing back onto the table. "Yeah, like we are creating our own worst nightmare. Maybe we just work too hard. We probably need water and sleep," Jack reasoned. Finding his own argument convincing, he nodded his head to himself. But Jacob, usually the most positive of the bunch, was not buying it. "No, that's not it," he said solemnly, and his eyes moved from the stack of rocks on the table towards the desk, where the journal from the night before sat. "The mine," he whispered, the color draining from his face. It's cursed. We were warned." The declaration hung in the air, heavier than the disappointment that enveloped them. Silence followed for a few moments as the men took in Jacob's words. But Mitch wouldn't have it. Suddenly he leaned in, his face just inches from Jacob's. Then he yelled in rage, "Cursed! You're actually buying into those damn old wives' tales? You rube!" he roared, spit flying from his mouth as he berated Jacob, who could only sit there in shock. "We're from the city, Jacob, not superstitious fools from the hinterlands." Jacob, taken aback, stammered, But Mitch. Mitch wasn't listening. The pent-up frustration erupted. He stood up straight, backed away from Jacob a step or two, and then swung a fist, catching Jacob square on the jaw. Jacob's head flew to one side, and he slunk to the side of his chair, holding his face in his hands. Jack jumped up from his chair and quickly stood between the two men. "What is wrong with you?" Jack bellowed, his eyes blazing as he stared down Mitch. Jacob stood, holding his jaw in one hand, eyes now blazing with anger. He was ready to fight. Jack, who was larger in frame than either of the men, formed a barrier between them. "This ain't a time for violence," he yelled at the two. "Our bodies have had enough for the day." Jacob nodded in agreement, stepping back hesitantly. But Jack's attempt to diffuse the tension did little to thin the palpable unease enveloping the room. In a surge of frustration, Mitch seemed to channel his anger towards the very source of their despair. "Damn you, Yik-Yak Mine!" he cried out, arms outstretched, voice bouncing off the walls and filling the haunting void. From the abyss of the encompassing forest outside came a response. An unsettling, uncanny laughter pierced the night, trailed by a croak. "Yik, yak." The tone, otherworldly and reminiscent of a deep-throated frog, froze them in their tracks. All three stood stock still, a mix of terror and disbelief widening their eyes. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Jack finally broke the silence. "I've had enough," he declared with grim determination. "Our only option now is to leave." His words, though meant for all, were directed more at Jacob, who seemed the most grounded amidst the chaos. "At night?" Jacob queried, his voice laced with exhaustion. "In the morning," Jack declared with gravity. As his words settled, there was an unspoken accord between him and Jacob. They subtly withdrew from the sitting area, their movements reflecting a mutual desire to distance themselves from the day's inexplicable events and to seek the refuge of sleep. The terrifying cry from the forest still played on Jacob's nerves as he ventured outside, clutching 2 large buckets. Moonlight washed over the porch, illuminating the nearby pump in a ghostly light. Water would be essential for the chores at hand, so he ventured forth. Each of his steps felt fraught with tension, the weight of every footfall heavy with silent bravery. Inside, the soft gurgle of whiskey being poured filled the room. The golden liquid shimmered under the lantern's light as Jack treated himself to a hearty drink, seeking a momentary escape from the day's horrifying events. Mitch, overcome by grief, slumped into the comforting folds of the couch. His slouched form was the picture of exhaustion and turmoil, his face obscured by his hands as he grappled with the incomprehensible. Their shattered dreams painted the cabin walls with gloom that night. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, their silent despair punctuated by occasional grunts of disbelief. The whiskey, which they thought would be their celebration, was now a bitter balm to their crushed hopes. Mitch was uncharacteristically silent, brooding by the fire. His eyes, reflecting the dancing flames, bore a vacant look, as if he was questioning the very foundations of his beliefs. Every once in a while he would pick up one of the chunks of rocks and examine it one more time, only to be disappointed once again. Jack, having calmed himself with both whiskey and some food, ventured back to the desk in the corner. He reached into the drawer, pulling out the journal he had read from the night before. The time-worn book felt heavy in his hands. He dreaded looking at it again, but after the events of today, he knew he had to take one more look. Jacob watched with eager anticipation as Jack opened it. Unable to read himself, he depended on the elder man's ability. Jacob drew near to listen to the words Jack now read aloud. Jack began, "We can't believe our luck. What an unexpected treat to have fully equipped cabin to rest in such a long journey. We will sleep tonight and get to work in the morning." Jack paused for a moment and said, "Next entry. We were about to settle in for the night when we heard the most terrifying noise. I know it sounds crazy, but all of us heard it. It was laughter coming from the forest outside. Thank God for this cabin. We are all too terrified to go back out there, even for some extra water." Then another pause before Jack read the next entry. "Today we hit the mother lode. I can't believe it. Gold, everywhere. I am the first to return to the cabin after an incredible day. We were down there for probably 10 hours, chipping away at the veins. It was incredible. Gold seemed to run through the entire wall in front of us. Unfortunately, Larry struck me with his pickaxe. The weirdest thing. I swear, he did it on purpose, so I had to return to bandage myself. I will go back and help them carry the load we gathered, but I am taking a moment to recuperate." Then after another pause, turning the page, "Nothing makes sense. The rocks we excavated are all just rocks. No gold to be found. Larry's going nuts, and the others had to hold him back from attacking me. We will return in the morning." Then Jack hesitated to read aloud, taking a moment to scan the page ahead before reading it aloud. Jacob looked on in anticipation. "What happens next?" Jacob asked inquisitively. "Nothing," Jack said in despair. "There is a new entry from a new group." "Read that one," Jacob said, his voice shaky with fear and anticipation. Jack cleared his throat and began reading the next entry. "We arrived at the cabin today with a mix of anticipation and exhaustion. Our journey was long, and we are tired, but inexplicable whispers and peculiar bangs keep occurring in every corner of this place. Sam, with his usual bravado, is telling us to dismiss them as the wind playing tricks. But Father O'Malley, a former member of the clergy, looks deeply troubled. He is currently holding a crucifix tight in his hand and praying quietly to himself. I do hope we get some needed rest tonight. Jack turned the page and then began the second entry. This morning, we headed out for our first excavation, but just a few steps into the shaft, we unearthed the grisly remains of former miners, a rusted helmet, a worn-out shoe, and most shockingly, skeletal remains that disturbingly still have rotting flesh in them. A heavy weight of responsibility and reverence came upon us. Father O'Malley was adamant that before we lay claim to any gold, we must first lay these souls to rest. The others agreed, so, setting aside our avarice, we spent today gathering the scattered remains and giving them a dignified burial, with Father O'Malley performing a somber last rite. We were going to go back into the mine to attempt a shortened excavation, but Peter began behaving oddly, his voice suddenly filled with unfamiliar tones, and his movements becoming erratic. We have returned to the cabin in hopes that we can shake him from this strange illness. But I am afraid this place may not be the best location to ease a troubled mind. The walls around us continue with their strange whispers, and those odd knocks on the windows and floorboards have not ceased. Both Jacob and Mitch were listening intently. Though Mitch remained on the couch, he could not help but turn his head and drop his jaw a little as Jack continued to read the entries aloud. The walls of this old cabin are my only protection now. That thing in Peter, it's taken him over. This morning, we ventured into the mine, and indeed we rejoiced when we saw the veins of gold, like nothing I could have dreamed of. Huge shining veins fill the walls of that mine. We had only just begun to chip into the rock when suddenly Peter attacked us. It was a horrifying sight, watching as Peter brutally struck down Father O'Malley and then turned his frenzied attack on Sam. I tried my best to stop him. I even struck him with my own axe, but he was like a demon. His strength was beyond human. I fled. I feel like a coward. I left Sam to die, but I managed to escape. I ran back to the cabin, the chilling sounds of Peter's twisted laughter chasing me as I went. Now he's out there, waiting, occasionally thudding against the cabin's walls. The shadows play tricks. Sometimes I swear I can see Father O'Malley's spirit, hand raised in a final blessing, or perhaps a warning. Oh God, he's opening the window. I must go now. And that was where Jack ended his reading, looking up from the page with terror in his eyes. That's the end? Jacob gasped. Jack nodded solemnly. He flipped through the pages, scanning them vigorously. It's all the same. Every entry goes like this. They start hopeful, but once any group enters the mine, they tell of horrible events. Violence, ghostly apparitions, murder. Jack whispered the last words. Laying down the journal, Jack stood, the room falling into silence, as his two companions only stared back in horror. His face was pale under the lantern light, eyes reflecting a dread that was mirrored in the other men. Boys, he began, his voice wavering slightly, we need to leave. We need to leave as soon as dawn breaks. The words hung in the room like a tangible thing. Mitch finally looked away from the fire, his gaze hard, while Jacob shifted uncomfortably, his unease apparent. That mine, Jack continued, holding up his journal, it's haunted. There's a cursed spirit in there, something beyond any ghost. And it's got a hold of us. This, he said, tapping the journal, is the account of the miners before us. The same gold turning to rock, the same laughter, and then murders, many of them. Mitch shook his head violently, as if cleansing himself from the fear that had formerly gripped him. His eyes opened wide, and he grinned as if the most fantastic realization had just crossed his mind. Boys, this curse, or whatever it is, it doesn't want us to take the gold. That's what it is. The illusion is not that there is gold. The illusion is that there is not gold, he said, suddenly ecstatic with joy. These rocks are full of gold. We just can't see it." Mitch's eyes gleamed with a crazed glare. He lifted a chunk of rock from the table again, gazing at it with that mad look in his eyes. But Jack continued, ignoring Mitch's insane suggestion. "Don't speak the name of the mine again. It seems to be a trigger, a call to whatever resides in there. Remember, when we spoke the name of it, in front of the mine's entrance? We all heard that awful laugh." Jack was adamant. He looked to each of the men with a staunch expression of authority, demanding agreement. Jacob shuddered, wrapping his arms around himself as if trying to ward off a chill. "A demon?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jack nodded gravely. "Yes, Jacob, a demon. We've trespassed, and now we will pay the price if we stay any longer. We must leave before it's too late." Just as Jack's words faded into the charged air, a sudden gust of wind surged against the cabin with a force so violent that it shook the very foundations. The windows rattled in their frames, and the whole structure creaked ominously, as if straining under some colossal burden. Jacob, gripped by fear, sprinted towards his bunk, curling up in an attempt to find some semblance of safety. Jack stood still, his body as rigid as a steel beam, his eyes wide and filled with terror. Mitch, however, only grinned, an eerie, malicious grin that did not fit the situation. His eyes twinkled with a gleam of madness, and he threw his head back and laughed, a sound that chilled the blood of the other man's veins. And then he uttered the name that Jack had just warned them never to speak again. "Yik-Yak!" Mitch screeched in a horrifying tone. The words echoed in the cabin, and the other two men screamed. Jack, in a fit of anger and fear, stormed towards Mitch. "You damn fool!" he roared, grabbing Mitch's collar and shaking him violently. But Mitch was unaffected. He only stared back at Jack with a strange, almost unhinged gleam in his eyes, as if he was a puppet possessed by a malignant spirit. Enraged and horrified, Jack trudged off to his own bunk, snapping at the others over his shoulder. "When the sun's up, I'm out of here," he declared with finality. Jacob, his head already buried under the covers in a feeble attempt to ward off the horror, grunted his agreement. Helped by the numbing effects of the whiskey, Jack eventually succumbed to a restless sleep. Jacob shook in his bunk for a long time, unable to calm himself. He tried not to open his eyes, but whenever he did, he peered over to the couch where Mitch remained, still fawning over the chunks of rock that lay on the little table. Eventually, late in the night, he succumbed to sleep as well. The first light of dawn roused Jacob from his uneasy slumber. Despite the lingering taste of cheap whiskey in his mouth and a mild headache, his youthful resilience helped him spring out of bed with relative ease. His eyes fell on the other bunks, and he noticed with a pang of worry that Mitch's was empty. A quick scan of the cabin revealed that his boots and jacket were gone too. Reluctantly, Jacob ventured outside, his heart pounding in his chest. His gut knew where Mitch had ventured to, remembering his crazed ideas that the gold was in fact real. There was no doubt in his mind that Mitch had returned to that accursed place. A chill ran down his spine at the thought of entering the shaft again, but his concern for his friend overpowered his fear. Fueled by a sense of duty and concern, he picked up his lantern and steeled himself for the journey ahead. Plunging into the abyss of the Yik-Yak Mine, he ventured forth, the echoes of Mitch's pickaxe hitting rock serving as his grim guide. As he ventured deeper, the chilling sound of laughter mixed in with the sound of metal striking rock. Jacob's stomach churned with unease. The reality of Mitch's manic obsession was sinking in. He called out to his friend, his voice trembling. "Mitch, it's me, Jacob." There was no answer, only the constant rhythm of the pickaxe hitting the rock. With a mix of concern and apprehension, he continued his journey deeper into the mine, the light from his lantern casting long, monstrous shadows on the tunnel walls. Finally, Jacob reached the end of the tunnel. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. working away at a manic pace. Drenched in sweat, Mitch was relentlessly chipping at the rock face. Mitch's lantern sat on a pile of new mounds of what looked like gold. "Stop it, Mitch. We need to get out of here," Jacob called out in panic as the sight unfolded before him, but his plea fell on deaf ears. As Jacob watched the unfolding of his friend's sanity, his eyes couldn't help but return to those piles of gold that were accumulating around Mitch. As he came close, Jacob kneeled down to examine the chunks of golden veined stone. The glimmering yellow metal twinkled in the lantern light, its allure impossible to resist. The dreams he had tasted just the day before returned to his mind. He picked up a piece, its weight solid and real, in his hand. His mind teetered on the edge of disbelief and wild anticipation. "Is this real?" he muttered, entranced by the glittering specimen. Suddenly, the striking of the pickaxe ceased. Jacob looked up to see Mitch turning towards him. With a wild, frenzied gleam in his eyes, Mitch responded in a voice barely above a whisper, "It is." But then a wave of clarity swept over Jacob, his sense of reality pushing back against the intoxicating allure of the illusionary gold. He dropped the deceptive stone. The clinking sound of it hitting the others as it fell to the ground rang through the tunnel. He straightened up, looking at his friend with a resolute gaze. "No, it isn't," he stated firmly. "And we need to leave. Now." His voice echoed off the rocky walls, the gravitas of his statement hanging heavily in the dim, confined space. Mitch looked at Jacob, his eyes glowing with a dangerous intensity. "You're wrong," he spat out, each word infused with venomous defiance. Jacob didn't waver. He stood his ground, his conviction stronger than the illusion the haunted mine presented. "Once we take this out of this mine, it will revert back to stone," he argued, the fervor in his voice failing to mask the worry etched on his face. "Because that's what it is, Mitch. It's just stone." And with those last words coming from Jacob's mouth, Mitch drove his pickaxe into the top of poor Jacob's head. The young man, mouth still agape, breathed out the last letters of his final statement, his face staring blankly back at Mitch, his body crumpled to the ground, the long metal spike making a squishing sound as it was released from the young man's skull. The sound of delirious celebration reverberated through the morning air, rousing Jack from his intoxicated slumber. Mitch's ecstatic cries were tinged with an edge of insanity that sent a cold ripple of apprehension down Jack's spine. "I've cracked it," Mitch was shrieking, his voice echoing through the woods around the cabin. "The secret. It's mine now." Jack, his head throbbing and stomach churning from the remnants of the whiskey in his guts, staggered to his feet, his pulse quickening as he began to comprehend Mitch's words that rang out through the windows around him. Could Mitch have truly found a way to circumvent the mine's bewitching curse? Could the gold exist outside the shaft? The notion seemed fantastical, but the echo of Mitch's laughter fueled a tiny spark of hope in Jack's chest. He was fully aware of and remembered the horrific journal entries he had read the night before, yet he couldn't help but be intrigued by the prospect of the gold being real. As he stumbled out of his bunk, he steadied himself against the wall, shivering with anticipation and the chill of the early morning air. In the soft glow of dawn, Mitch stood tall, his mining gear slick with sweat, beside a mining cart filled with ominous bounty. Jack's heart fluttered in horror as he stepped forward, his gaze locked on the overflowing cart. As he approached, the glimmer he had hoped to see within the cart was absent. Instead, a gruesome sight met his eyes. The cart was filled with rocks, plain gray rocks, rocks that did not shimmer with the glint of gold, but he did see a tinge of moisture on them. And there were oddly shaped pieces of things amongst those rocks, mingling with the cargo. The sight of it froze Jack in his tracks, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the morning sunlight, his breath hitching as the grim reality of what he was observing began to take shape. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum. Each beat echoed with his glowing horror. As he leaned in for a closer look, his worst fears were confirmed. It wasn't gold glistening within the cart, nor was it moisture from the dripping ceiling of the cave. It was blood, still fresh and wet, mingling with those mundane rocks in a grotesque spectacle. The sickening metallic scent wafted into Jack's nostrils, making his stomach lurch violently. And the strangely shaped pieces scattered amongst those rocks were dismembered hands, feet, and what he thought might be Jacob's face, peeking out from beneath the piles of stone. A stone-cold shiver ran down Jack's spine as his gaze slowly rose up to meet Mitch's. The man's eyes, which were once filled with a bright, sparkling determination, now glowed with an eerie, unhinged madness that chilled Jack to the bone. Mitch's lips pulled into a grotesque grin as he raised his bloodied pickaxe, gesturing with his head towards the horrific contents of the cart. "I found the secret, Jack," he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice echoing ominously in the still mountain air. "A blood sacrifice, that's what it needs. That's what this cursed mine wanted all along." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless with shock. His gaze involuntarily flitted back to the cart. It was the head of poor Jacob, face half buried in the bloody rocks, but he could see it now, the face of the innocent young man who had been so unlucky as to be conned into this ridiculous journey. His breath came out in a choked gasp. "Jacob!" He stumbled backwards, the horrifying truth hitting him like a freight train. Mitch, in his crazed pursuit of wealth, had committed the unthinkable. The joyous cheers from earlier rung out in Jack's ears like a nightmarish chorus, the chilling reality of Mitch's victory sinking deep into his bones. With every fiber of his being screaming at him to flee, Jack whirled around and made a desperate dash down the worn pathway they had journeyed on just days before. His middle-aged body protested against his sudden exertion, the aftermath of the whiskey's grip making his vision blur and his head pound mercilessly. His heavy boots stumbled over the uneven terrain, loose rocks skidding beneath his desperate strides. He could barely hear his own labored breath, the wind whistling past his ears and the pounding of his heart echoing in his skull were the only sensory intake his body would allow during his desperate flight. Over this symphony of fear, one other vibration passed through his ears, the chilling sound of determined footfalls that followed him. Then Mitch's voice cut through the thin mountain air like a knife, a threat veiled as a playful taunt. "Oh, no, you don't." Jack's breath hitched in his throat as terror sliced through his mind. Mitch's footfalls grew steadily closer, the younger man's athletic build giving him a terrible advantage in this deadly chase. Despair mingled with Jack's terror, the seemingly inevitable outcome looming over him like a shadow of the haunted mountain. He tried his best to flee, but a misstep sent him tumbling to the ground. Lifting his gaze, he saw Mitch looming above him, pickaxe held high above his head. As the day meandered towards its end, a final burst of sunlight gilded the facade of the town bank. Inside, the bank manager methodically packed up his paperwork, the humdrum rhythm of his routine providing a comforting end to another day. This quiet comfort was violently shattered when the bank doors were thrust open with a sudden bang. A chilling breeze trailed in, carrying with it the tang of iron and something else that made the banker's stomach churn. His eyes snapped up to the door, and all the color drained from his face. He recognized the man, that stubborn leader of the nearly penniless group of miners who had been here a few days ago. An unhinged grin splitting the man's face as he pushed a minecart through the door. Its contents were a gruesome sight, blood-soaked gray stones along with horrifying chunks of what must have been human remains. Each time he trundled the old cart forward, the thump of something disturbingly soft and wet banged against the cart's metal. The sound sent waves of nausea through the banker's body. "I did it!" Mitch's voice, unusually jovial, was laced with a manic edge. His bloodshot eyes gleamed with madness. "I won, and I'm here to make a deposit." The declaration echoed ominously through the bank. The manager could do nothing but stare in abject horror at the macabre spectacle. It was indeed his own fault. He had damned these poor men to a horrible fate. As Mitch's laughter rang out, unhinged and jarring, the setting sun gleamed a golden hue over the stones, and for just a moment the banker swore he saw a cartload full of gold.